China's worst decade in 500 years doesn't begin with tanks. It begins with empty apartments, with local governments quietly running out of cash, with young people refusing to buy homes, with debt piling up faster than growth can hide it. For decades, the world has told one story: China only goes up. But right now, the pillars that held up that rise are cracking, all at once. Property, which once made up roughly a quarter of the economy, local governments drowning in hidden obligations, a population aging faster than it can replace itself, a generation that no longer believes that tomorrow will be richer than today. This isn't a normal slowdown, it's a convergence. And when a system built on endless growth suddenly runs out of momentum, history suggests that the fall isn't gentle. This is how China's worst decade in 5,000 years will begin. China's modern rise can be told as a story of concrete, urbanization at breakneck speed, entire skylines rewritten in a decade, infrastructure as national muscle, and at the center of it all, housing. Not just as shelter, but as the financial architecture underneath everything. Research by economists Kenneth Rogoff and Yaoshen Yang estimated that real estate and its related sectors made up roughly 1/4 of China's entire GDP in recent years. That's an extraordinary share for any major economy. And at its peak, the total value of China's housing stock was estimated at more than double that of the United States. But here's the part that turns a property slump into a full-blown national crisis. Housing wasn't just an industry in China, it was a national savings account. A 2019 People's Bank of China survey found that for urban households, housing made up nearly 70% of total assets. Independent academic research using China Family Panel Studies data confirmed the same picture. Housing accounted for roughly 3/4 of all household wealth in the early 2010s. When an entire society stores its future in one asset class, a price decline, it's not just a financial event, it's a psychological earthquake. Spending freezes, confidence collapses, people stop buying, they stop investing, stop believing. And that shift doesn't reverse quickly, because the loss isn't just financial, it's personal. It's a family that spent 20 years saving for a home and now watches the value drop month after month. It's a retiree whose entire net worth was supposed to be in that apartment. The system that created this problem relies on a very specific pipeline. Developers finance construction through pre-sales. Families handed over their life savings for apartments that hadn't been built yet. Local governments controlled the land and sold usage rights. Banks and shadow lenders provided the credit. Rising prices kept the whole machine spinning. Land revenue funded infrastructure. Infrastructure boosted land values. Higher land values attracted more buyers. Now, for years, it looked like perpetual motion. But perpetual motion doesn't exist in economics. And when the machine stalled, it stalled hard. In 2024, sales by the top 100 real estate developers dropped by more than 28%. Housing prices in lower-tier cities entered steep correction. Real estate investment posted its largest annual decline since 2004. Through mid-2025, the World Bank documented a further 6.4% contraction in property prices. And the bleeding, it hasn't stopped. Across the country, academic researchers have documented high vacancy rates in smaller cities, using the term ghost cities to describe places where housing was built years ahead of any demand. Entire districts sit empty. New apartment towers with no lights on at night. Shopping malls with no shoppers. Now, these aren't outliers. They're symptoms of a system that kept building long after the need had peaked. Bloomberg reported that in late 2025, Beijing actually began censoring social media posts about the housing market, scrubbing content that was deemed too negative about prices and policy. When a government starts silencing discussion of a crisis, the crisis is usually worse than what they were admitting. The big names tell part of the story. Evergrande, once China's largest developer, defaulted on over $300 billion in debt. In August of 2025, it was formally delisted from the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, its shares effectively worthless. China Vanke, a developer once seen as a safe bet because of its government connections, posted a record $6.8 billion loss for 2024. Over 60 developers have either defaulted on offshore debt or entered restructuring negotiations. And the human cost behind the corporate headlines is enormous. Tens of millions of Chinese families paid upfront for apartments through that pre-sale system. Homes that were never completed. Construction stopped. Developers disappeared. Life savings, gone. This wasn't just construction, it was belief poured into concrete. And the damage doesn't stop with developers and homebuyers. Industries downstream from real estate, we're talking cement, steel, furniture, home renovation, elevators, are all under severe strain. For private business owners in these sectors, the downturn, it hasn't just been painful, it's been existential. And when that belief cracked, it didn't stay in housing. It bled straight into the fiscal system holding the entire country together. Because here's what most people don't realize. China's property collapse is also a government funding collapse. And what's happening underneath is even more alarming than what's visible on the surface. After China's 1994 tax-sharing reforms, a structural gap opened up. The central government kept the major tax instruments. Local governments got stuck with the heavy spending obligations. Schools, hospitals, roads, metros, salaries, public services. The OECD described how this left local governments with large responsibilities but limited tax autonomy. That gap didn't close. It got filled by land. Local governments would acquire land cheaply. They'd convert it and then sell land use rights to developers at a markup. The revenue funded nearly everything. Academic research documented that official land sales revenue exceeded 55 trillion yuan between 2007 and 2020. In certain peak years, land-related income made up close to 40% of local government budgets. The whole system ran on a single assumption: land prices will only go up. When property markets cooled, land auctions collapsed, and local fiscal capacity dropped almost overnight. The Reserve Bank of Australia published detailed research showing that land sales revenue, historically the most important source of local government income, contracted sharply in the early 2020s. And what filled the gap was worse. Local government financing vehicles, or LGFVs, state-owned entities that are created to borrow and invest on behalf of local governments, especially when formal borrowing was restricted. Now, after the 2008 global stimulus, LGFVs expanded rapidly, becoming central conduits for local investment and evolving into complex corporate platforms with diversified holdings. By 2023, the IMF estimated that LGFV debt had reached roughly 48% of China's entire GDP, around $9 trillion. But even the IMF treats that figure as a floor. The true burden could be significantly larger, because much of this debt is opaque, off-balance sheet, and nearly impossible to price accurately. On a cash basis and without government subsidies, UBS analysis found that only 19% of LGFVs can actually service their interest payments. The rest are surviving on implicit guarantees and accounting maneuvers. What happens when local governments can't meet their obligations? In open markets, you get defaults and restructuring, visible, legal, priced. In China, you get something quieter, in many ways more corrosive. Delayed contractor payments, frozen construction projects, civil servant salary cuts of 30 to 50% across multiple provinces. In Hainan, one of China's most populous provinces, government workers saw their pay slashed in half. In Guangdong, China's richest province, even public employees took significant cuts. Cities that can't keep their streetlights on, municipalities selling off government buildings because they can't afford the upkeep, airports that never see planes, stadiums that don't host games. It's not a dramatic collapse, but a slow, grinding squeeze that erodes public trust from the ground up. And in several provinces, interest expenses on local debt now exceed 10% of revenues, meaning that these governments are borrowing just to stay afloat, not to grow. China's leadership is now attempting one of the most dangerous balancing acts in modern economic history. You shrink the property sector to a sustainable size without crashing the banking system, restructure local government debt without triggering cascading defaults, maintain social stability while cutting the very spending that keeps communities running. Now, each of these goals collides with the others, and the margin for error gets thinner by the quarter. But here's what makes this decade truly different from any slowdown that China has faced before. Debt can be restructured. Property can eventually stabilize. Stimulus can buy time, but you can't negotiate with demography. Hey, if you're following this and you want more deep dives into how global powers really rise and fall, be sure to hit subscribe, because what comes next may be the most destabilizing shift of all. In 2025, China recorded just 7.92 million births, a 17% plunge from the year before, and the lowest number since records began in 1949. Deaths outpaced births by more than 3.39 million. China's population shrank for the fourth consecutive year, falling to 1.405 billion. To put that in perspective, China's annual births have dropped to a level comparable to 1738, when the country's total population was roughly 150 million. The birth rate fell to 5.63 per 1,000 people, which is the lowest on record since the founding of the People's Republic. Today, 323 million Chinese citizens are over the age of 60. That's 23% of the entire population, and it jumped a full percentage point in just 1 year. The working age population keeps contracting, 851 million in 2025, down nearly 7 million from the year before. The UN estimates China's fertility rate has plummeted to about 1.0, less than half the 2.1 needed just to maintain a stable population. The long-range projection is staggering. China's 1.4 billion people could shrink to 633 million by 2100, nearly halved in a single lifetime. The government has thrown everything at this crisis. Cash bonuses for families with young children, free public preschool, streamlined marriage registration, mandates requiring hospitals to offer pain relief through childbirth. They even taxed condoms, removing contraceptives from a tax exemption list and slapping a 13% levy on birth control starting in January of 2025. President Xi has openly urged women to embrace what he calls a new type of marriage and childbearing culture. But none of this has reversed the trend. Researchers say it won't, because once women gain reproductive freedom, no government incentive reliably reverses that choice. The number of women aged 20 to 34 responsible for 85% of births is projected to drop from 105 million in 2025 to just 58 million by 2050. That math simply doesn't allow a recovery. And the consequences are already landing. A typical family structure in China now looks like this: 4 grandparents, 2 parents, and 1 child. They call them 4-2-1 families. That 1 child is expected to support 6 older people. It's a mathematical impossibility that's becoming a lived reality for hundreds of millions. China's pension system is already under severe strain. Multiple provinces have reported shortfalls, and the ratio, it keeps worsening. In the 1980s, 8 working-age Chinese supported each retiree, and today, it's closer to 4. By the mid-2030s, it could be 2. That's not an economy that can sustain itself, let alone compete globally. And there's a layer that almost nobody discusses. China still carries the long shadow of its one-child policy, not just in birth rates, but in gender imbalance. The 2020 census reported a sex ratio at birth of 111.3 males per 100 females. That number has improved since earlier decades, but the cumulative legacy is a massive cohort of men facing what researchers call a marriage squeeze. Peer-reviewed research published in the Review of Economics and Statistics found a statistically significant link between skewed sex ratios and rising crime among young adults. And the effect intensifies when paired with unemployment, low social status, and limited mobility. In a high-growth era, the state could absorb the pressure through jobs, migration, and rising wages. In a low-growth era, with official youth unemployment around 16%, but independent analysts estimating closer to 46%, well, that pressure becomes dangerously exposed. Only 6.1 million couples married in 2024. That's a record low, down dramatically from the 13 million marriages recorded just a decade earlier. Young Chinese have a word for that withdrawal: lying flat. Refusing to compete, refusing to buy, refusing to reproduce. It started as internet slang, but now it's the subject of peer-reviewed academic journals, framed as passive resistance to a system that no longer delivers on its promises. Some call it a quiet rebellion. Others call it surrender. Either way, it means fewer workers, fewer consumers, and fewer families. Exactly the opposite of what China needs. A system built on momentum is now powered by hesitation. But demographics don't explode overnight. They corrode something quieter and more dangerous: confidence. Modern economies run on belief. When households believe housing will hold value, they buy. When entrepreneurs believe that rules will stay stable, they invest. When local governments believe that they can refinance, they build. But you break that belief, and behavior changes quickly. Money will hide, hiring freezes, families postpone children. A national mood of caution becomes self-reinforcing. The evidence is piling up. The Erosion Group, an independent research firm, estimated China's actual GDP growth in both 2024 and 2025 at between 2.5 and 3%, roughly half of the official 5% figure. The gap was significant enough that even the U.S. Federal Reserve independently analyzed whether Chinese statistics were overstated. That alone tells you how deep the credibility questions are running. Now, peer-reviewed research also has documented a measurable decline in trust in local governments. This follows the extended pandemic lockdowns, which were a sign that performance failures leave lasting marks even in systems with tight control. When people feel that the government has mishandled a crisis, the skepticism doesn't vanish when the crisis ends. It lingers, and it shapes how they respond to the next set of promises. In 2025, Fitch Ratings downgraded China from A+ to A, citing rising public debt and an eroding revenue base. Consumer prices barely moved. The CPI rose just 0.2% in 2024, a sign of persistent deflationary pressure that stimulus has struggled to reverse. Nominal GDP growth fell below real GDP growth, a rare and telling signal of economy-wide deflation driven by weak domestic demand. Households are saving more and spending less. Retail spending, while technically positive, masks a reality of cautious consumers who simply aren't willing to commit. And when China's National Bureau of Statistics revised its youth unemployment methodology, excluding students from the count and redefining who qualifies as, quote, seeking work, it didn't ease anxiety, it deepened it. Because in a society already nervous about jobs and housing, changing how you measure the problem doesn't change the problem itself. Trust doesn't require proof to fracture, it only requires doubt. And doubt is spreading. When belief breaks inside an authoritarian system, the pressure doesn't dissipate outward. It moves upward, toward the center. When systems enter structural stress, the decisive question isn't whether leaders are smart or determined, it's whether the menu of viable choices remains wide enough to navigate the crisis without making it worse. China's menu is narrowing fast. The IMF has warned that a deeper than expected property contraction combined with high debt could trigger adverse macro-financial feedback loops, the classic post-bubble trap. Stimulate too much and debt balloons further. Stimulate too little and the downturn deepens. Force a rapid cleanup and financial stress accelerates. Every option has a price. Prominent scholars like Susan Shirk at UC San Diego have argued that China has shifted back toward personalistic rule under Xi Jinping. With weakened succession norms, tighter concentration of power, and diminished internal debate, that matters because authoritarian regimes rarely fall from popular uprising. They fracture from within, through elite splits. Institutionalized succession reduces that risk. Personalized rule amplifies it. And when economic performance falters, elite cohesion becomes both more critical and harder to sustain. The external environment is turning hostile too. Trade tensions with the United States intensified through 2025. Tariffs returned, technology restrictions tightened, and the global mood shifted toward what the IMF calls fragmentation pressure. China posted a record $1.2 trillion trade surplus in 2025. But that surplus increasingly depends on an export machine that major trading partners are actively pushing back against. And so the vicious triangle tightens. Slowdown leads to tighter control. Tighter control suppresses private sector dynamism. Less dynamism makes recovery harder, which demands even more control. Round and round it goes. None of this means collapse is inevitable. China still retains enormous strengths, a massive industrial base, deep state capacity, vast savings reserves, and the ability to mobilize resources at a scale that few countries can match. In the optimistic scenario, the state accepts slower growth. It restructures local finances, lets failed developers exit, expands social protection, and builds trust through transparency. Property becomes a smaller sector, not a systemic threat. But the pessimistic scenario is just as plausible and far more dangerous. The system tries to preserve the old growth model with new debt. It keeps insolvent firms alive, suppresses bad news rather than fixing the causes, relies increasingly on coercion to manage discontent. In that world, the cracks deepen, local governments cut harder, youth disengage further, households save more and spend less, and elite politics grows more anxious as the circle of trust starts to narrow. So what does that next decade actually look like? Not famine, not civil war. China has endured eras in which tens of millions have perished, empires have fractured, and warlords have fought over ruined provinces. The claim that this could be the worst decade in 5,000 years, it's not about bloodshed on that scale. It's about convergence, a modern, globally integrated superpower, home to 1.4 billion people, woven into every supply chain, commodity market, and shipping lane on Earth, facing simultaneous stress in property, debt, demography, trust, and governance, all while the global environment grows less forgiving. All the while, the room to absorb shocks keeps shrinking. And the stakes aren't only Chinese. When the world's second largest economy stalls, the tremors reach everywhere. Commodity markets, industrial supply chains, currency systems, bond markets, and the climate trajectory of the entire planet. A prolonged period of Chinese weakness, it won't be a regional event. It would be systemic. China's dynastic history taught a lesson that modern economics restate in a different language. When fiscal capacity weakens, when legitimacy becomes contested, and when crises arrive faster than institutions can adapt, stability turns fragile. Empires rarely fall in a single year. They weaken when too many pillars crack at the same time. And for China, that decade starts now. So what do you think? Is this just a rough patch or the beginning of something that the world isn't ready for? Drop your take in the comments, and if you haven't already, subscribe to Fall of Nations. Because the forces shaping the global order, they're not slowing down.